This is part one of Unit 3. Unit 3 is going to focus on the first years of our country, where we wrote the Constitution, and then some of the first presidents as well. So we'll start talking a little bit about the Constitution in a minute, but let's first back up and talk about the first government that our country had, which is the Articles of Confederation, which you remember from last unit. Now, the Articles of Confederation had been around. It was formed during the American Revolution, and it was the government that presided over the country during that wartime and in the first years right after the war, when we were our own independent country. Okay? When they created the Constitution, or excuse me, the Articles of Confederation, you know that they were pretty cautious about giving the new government too much power. They had just fought a war to get rid of a power they thought was oppressive, and so they were very certain that if they did that in America, it would just be a repeat. So they wanted to create a government that didn't have a lot of power, which left it pretty weak. The Articles of Confederation just didn't have a lot of power to do anything. The two main weaknesses that it had is it did not have the power to tax the states. The states were supposed to send money. The states were supposed to give money to raise an army to defend the country and to build roads and these types of things, but they often did not send money, or not enough money. And the other thing is, the other weakness it had is that it didn't have any power to directly force the states to do anything. And so what ends up happening is the states often run their own show, and a lot of them were doing things that you would think a national government does. For example, some of them were printing their own money. Some states were actually negotiating treaties with countries in Europe all by themselves. So basically, the Articles of Confederation didn't have enough power to do anything. That's the main thing to remember. One exception to that would be something called the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance is important, which is why I have it underlined here. You'll see that quite a bit on AP tests. But it is something that directly impacts, or has a huge impact on America for many, many years to come, which is why it's important. This is basically sets up some guidelines or procedures for new territories. How are we going to map out new territories? How are these new territories going to become states? What's the process for that going to be? And that, as you can see here, is the first point to remember about the Northwest Ordinance. Is as we're expanding ever westward, we're getting new land, new territory. How are we going to put these into the original 13 states? How are we going to add them? It sets up guidelines for that. You see slavery here being mentioned. Slavery is going to be excluded north of the Ohio River. So in the northern part of our country, the slavery is not going to be permitted. This is interesting because slavery up to this point is kind of not talked about in our country a whole lot. It's pretty widely practiced, more prevalent in the South, of course, but still slavery in the North at this time. But the fact that it is included in here shows you that there is a growing sentiment in our country that slavery is an evil, that it should be at least limited. And so this is the first time really you see slavery talked about to any extent, and it just shows you that it's there, that there are some people that think slavery is wrong, and that's just going to continue to grow and grow and grow, and you'll see that more and more in the history of our country. 3, one of the things that the Northwest Ordinance did is it set aside land in every new territory. As they surveyed it, they broke it down. They're going to set aside a certain section for schools, public schools in each township. A certain part of land is going to be set aside for free public education, which is going to be, of course, something that's going to continue. And that comes back to our Puritan roots that we talked about in units previously. So that's the Articles of Confederation. Remember, it's very weak. It can't do a whole lot. But one thing that it did do was pass the Northwest Ordinance, which set a lot of rules and regulations for the new land that's going to be coming in and eventually become states. But the Articles of Confederation just was so weak that it just couldn't handle a lot of the things in the country, couldn't do anything. So the question on the board here is, what led to the Constitutional Convention? What led to people saying, hey, we got to meet, we got to gather, we got to talk about this because there's a lot of problems with this government that we need to address or fix? Well, some specific things to remember is this. One, just like today, when economic times are tough, people want change. And it's no exception at this time. During the war, inflation or high prices was very common. People, had a hard time during the war because goods cost a whole lot more. And then after the war, there was kind of what an economic downtime, what they often called panics in those days, where people just, weren't making enough money, had a hard time finding work. Some people were homeless, these kinds of things. So there was some economic crisis or some issues, and the government was so weak it couldn't handle them. Okay, so that's one thing that brought it. The convention, and it's just simply the Articles of Confederation just was not set up to handle these kind of big issues. Everything was left just to the states, and the states each did their own thing, and so there was no real unity it just looked like the country was going to bust apart and break up into smaller pieces because the Articles just didn't have enough power to do anything. And one thing that really sped up this process, that, hey, we got some issues here we got to work out, was something called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was primarily about taxes being so high that farmers couldn't pay them, and their farms were being foreclosed on. Farmers were being sent to prison then because they couldn't pay their debts. And, they just said, hey, we know how to handle this. These farmers said, we've been through this before. If rebellion worked against Britain, we can certainly rebel against this government if these taxes are unfair or unjust. And that's what they did. Now, they're not really trying to overthrow the government here like they were with Britain, maybe. It was mostly just about some people saying, hey, we don't think this is right. These are good, honest, hardworking people. They just can't pay their bills because the bills are just too excessive, too outrageous. And we need somebody to step in and help us. And when the government, under the Articles, couldn't because it was so weak, they just took matters into their own hands. So you can see, it says the main goals here were just to lower these taxes and to stop these farmers from being sent to prison and losing their family farms. And it did work. They did get a lot of attention. And this, as you can see here, the last bit of the slide, is really what spurred people into action, particularly James Madison, as we'll talk about. This basically said to people, if we don't do something and do something now, it might be too late. This country will fail. So it spurred people to action, and they basically said, let's have a meeting and figure out what to do. And that meeting, of course, is called the Constitutional Convention. That's basically just the meeting to figure out how to solve the problems of the Articles. Okay? Just some fun facts to know. It meets in Philadelphia. It starts in 1787 in the spring, as you can see. It's not huge that you remember the date so much as you just can remember the order of things. But 1787 is when they meet. 55 men from most of the colonies. You can see Rhode Island did not send anybody, but 55 men from all over came to discuss this. Generally, people ask, well, who are these guys? What kind of guys were they? Well, most of the 55 were wealthy. Most of them were landowners or businessmen. Most of them were fairly educated. They are the elite of our country. They're very bright-minded, but some of them, weren't, but some of the brightest minds were there. But some big names that you might be expecting to be there, names like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, or a guy named Patrick Henry who gave the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech from Virginia, were not there for various reasons. Some were busy serving overseas, like Jefferson and Adams as ambassadors to other countries. And some thought that this was a setup. Patrick Henry, for example, said, "I smell a rat." He thought the people at the Constitutional Convention were going to undo the work of the revolution and basically turn America back over into a monarchy with you know, a very strong government, and so he didn't want to be a part of that. So there's a little apprehension that this is a bad thing, but most of the guys that are there, they're sent there because they're good legal minds, they're leaders for a reason, but they are fairly wealthy people. They are people of means. They're not the salt of the earth kind of people. The original intent of the meeting was just to fix the articles. Okay? They didn't have the power. They were given the permission to meet and discuss, but they were not given permission to write a new government, which is what they ended up doing. Their original purpose was only to fix the problems of the articles, but basically James Madison, who was known as the father of the Constitution because many of his ideas got put into the new government, when it was decided that they're going to have a convention and meet, he started mapping out all the reasons why we got to get rid of the articles altogether. It's just a faulty plan, and we can't fix it. We just need to start from scratch. And ultimately, he won out then at the convention, and very quickly everybody agreed, let's just start over. So they were only supposed to fix the articles, but they quickly just said, let's create a new government, and that becomes the Constitution. And again, many of Madison's ideas get put in there, and that's why he's known as the father of the Constitution. And it was a pretty easy sell to get everybody on board that we need a whole new government. And so they quickly scratched the idea of fixing it and just start from, you know, new, start a fresh new government. Okay? Some issues at the Constitutional Convention. Okay? Some people are confused about this. We are technically not a democracy in this country. We are a republic. Okay? And that's what the people that were writing this new government wanted to do. They wanted to create a republic, not a democracy. What is the difference? And why do they not want a democracy? Well, the difference is a republic is when you elect people or you hire people to do your government work for you. You represent me. Okay? I don't vote on every single issue. You don't vote on every single issue. We hire people to do that. They're supposed to be the experts, and they represent us. They're supposed to kind of stand up for us or stand in for us, however you want to look at it. That's what a republic is. Why did they not want a democracy? Remember that video clip with the tar and feather? And remember where we talked about Governor Hutchinson saying, hey, these guys are a mob. They tore down my house just because they didn't like me, these kinds of things. Well, a lot of these people at the convention were very scared that if we give everyone the right to vote, and that's what a democracy is, where everybody gets to vote, those people aren't educated enough, they don't have a good enough mind. They're going to be a mob which someone could easily manipulate, and that was dangerous to them. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind. These people that are writing this government were very afraid that the common people, the people that worked with their hands, that barely knew how to read and write probably, they were very afraid of giving those people the right to vote because they didn't think they would use that right to vote very well. They would be too easily manipulated. It would be very scary to them. So they wanted to keep it more in the hands of the exceptional or the few, and that's kind of what a republic is. Their main issue that they had to tackle is the articles was so weak, we got to create a stronger government. But how do you create a strong government that you can control? They didn't want to go the other way again and go back to what they had with Britain, where you had one person or a few people with absolute control. We want to have a strong government, but we want to have a way to chain down or restrain that government. Okay? And so that's what they set out to do. And they put lots of restrictions in the Constitution to try to bind the new government down so it didn't become out of control. And here are three of the main ones. We're going to have the separation of powers. You know this, the three branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial. Okay? Then we have the checks and balance system where an action by one branch can be checked or voided by another branch. For example, if Congress passes the law, the President has the power to veto that law. You know that. That's what we're talking about. And then the issue of federalism. Federalism is the idea of we're going to split power between the states and the national government. and you know the articles, they wanted the states to have a lot of power, and that's still the case. Most of them want to have the states with a lot of power, and so they created this system where states can do some things and the national government can do some things. Some quick examples of this is in states, they have the power to set rules on education, marriage, these kinds of things. And the government is the only one that can declare war. The national government is the only one that could negotiate treaties and things like that with a foreign country. And there are some things that they both can do. For example, you have state taxes and you have federal taxes. But federalism is the idea that we're sharing power between the states and the national government. So these guys are meeting in Philadelphia. They are some of the best minds that we have. The guy that's leading them is James Madison. He's known as the father of the Constitution. And they're setting out trying to create a strong government, but one that they can control. And they put these restrictions on it. And that's where we're going to end with the first part here. And then we'll continue with part 2.